So on the spot and very on time, I would say, we would like to start this conversation. We are delighted to actually have this webinar in partnership with Bernard Van Leer Foundation. As you all know, growing up away from home, supporting refugee families and children in cities. So I'm privileged to be the moderator of today's discussion. It is only 1 hour, so I will not keep you waiting for it. But this webinar basically is a first step in what we hoped will be a longer engagement with UNHCR city leaders and other key actors around how to better support displaced refugee and migrant children and their families, inclusively with host communities. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our great partner, the Executive Director of the Bernard Van Leer Foundation, Cecilia Bassa-Jones. Since 2020, she has been the Executive Director of Bernard Van Leer Foundation after joining as Program Director in 2016. She has over 20 years of experience managing social development policies and programs, including as Coordinating Minister of Social Development of Ecuador between 2013 and 2016. She strongly believes and a champion actually leading those programs in cities, cities having the potential to act as champions themselves for innovation and positive change for children and families in a child-friendly design as well, as captured in the Bernard Van Leer Foundation's Urban 95 initiative. So I would like to invite Cecilia to introduce both Urban 95 and the extensive knowledge that has been accumulated throughout the years by Bernard Van Leer Foundation on early childhood education as well, and comment on its relevance to better supporting disadvantaged populations in cities, including refugee and migrant children. Thank you so much, Cecilia. It's over to you. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. And thank you, Shafak, for that introduction of myself. But I would really want to take advantage of 2 minutes of your time to say how important this topic is for the work that we do in the Bernard Van Leer Foundation. And for those of you who don't know the Bernard Van Leer Foundation, we have been working on early childhood development for over 60 years. So this is really the field of work that we believe we've learned a lot on just trying to understand how can we ensure a good start for all children. And then when I was looking at the topic of this seminar, which is basically trying to understand how our children, and especially children living in this social mobility conditions, which force them to be away from their families and from their communities and from their homelands, how are they growing up? So I do want to emphasize that from what we know in science and from what we know from our own work and what has been happening in cities, is that if we got to work with trying to close the gaps among the most vulnerable populations in any city, we definitely need to consider working with refugees and displaced people, because whatever these families and children are facing is going to determine the opportunities of their future. So we really need to take into account what's happening in these very early years. And as you have probably already read, what happens in the first years of life will determine a lot of the opportunities on the future. So we just want to make sure that we can all start learning from each other. So I really think that, as you were saying, Shafak, this is the first milestone of what we hope will be a great relationship with UNHCR and many different stakeholders that have the experience of hosting these families that are running away from difficult situations that are determined because of political situations, economic situations, in many other cases because of environmental situations. I've seen the panel today, and I'm super happy to see some friends will be speaking about their experience and work. So I will rather just stop here, and I will do some final remarks based on the different expositions that we will hear today. But welcome you all again, and please make sure that you can ask questions through the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia, for those great remarks and also the warm welcome you extended on behalf of all of us to the participants who are actually in the audience today, and our great esteemed panelists that we have today, who will kickstart the conversation with their some 5-minute scene-setting remarks from different angles on this topic, and which will be followed by Q&A, questions and answers by all participants and our panelists, and then we will move to concluding remarks. But the aim actually is to address the following questions, which has been communicated in the blurb that has been advertised with this event. What is the state of young refugee children from birth to 5 years old in cities, and what actions can cities plan to ensure they are thriving? What are the challenges currently being faced by cities in meeting the needs of young children and the people who care for them, and what examples of promising practices that are emerging which will allow us to have a learning experience amongst each other? And what do cities need from partners, including UNHCR and other levels of government, financial institutions, civil society, philanthropic institutions like Bernard van Leer Foundation, to better address the needs of young refugee children, and what can cities offer themselves? So I would like to start with our esteemed panelists for their scene-setting remarks, while our participants, the audience, are great contributors on the floor. Also, I would like to welcome their remarks in the chat and the questions that we're welcoming as well. So I would like to invite, first and foremost, Amanda Louise Melville, our Senior Advisor for Child Protection at United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Amanda, the floor is yours. Thank you. And if you could just set the scene by telling us about the experiences of very young refugee children living in cities. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much. So really a huge pleasure to be here with all of you today. My name is Amanda Melville. I'm the Senior Advisor for Child Protection for UNHCR. And I will be speaking about, what really are the experiences of younger children. So in terms of the first question, how many children are we talking about? So to summarize, the number of refugee children globally in 2020 was about 13.3 million. And this includes asylum-seeking children as well as refugee children under UNHCR and UNRWA's mandate. Overall of refugees, 46% are children, and a really substantial percentage of refugees are actually children 0 to 4. So 12% of refugee children are 0 to 4. Where are they living? So 5 countries in the world received over 40% of the displaced people and young children. And this includes the countries of Turkey, Colombia, Pakistan, Uganda, and Germany are the top 5. But it's also important to note that developing countries host 86% of the world's refugees, and the least developed countries host about 27%. So what this means is that, in short, most refugee children live in countries, in developing countries, and many in urban areas close to where they came from. And often the services for younger children are already stretched or insufficient. Increases in bilateral aid to support refugee hosting countries, and there's been recently a global report put out on this, are crucial to ensure that countries and cities hosting refugees receive the support to continue to provide these key services to both refugees and host communities. And when we talk about young children, what are some of their actual experiences of refugee children in cities? Well, often local service providers and communities in cities are at the front line of hosting and integrating refugees. And often this is done without additional support, additional financial support. So what does this mean concretely for a refugee child? So first and foremost, one of the first ways in which a refugee child would come into contact with services and in cities would be through child and maternal health care services. And then second, once the child is born, around birth registration services. And these are examples. Many of the cities have been really facilitating the kind of outreach services that are needed into urban areas hosting refugees. So, for instance, in Jordan, local municipalities worked in collaboration with the national birth registration services to really provide locations to host birth registration outreach services. Care at home. So for most refugee young children, they will be cared at home, where they will be continued to be cared for by their mothers or other women family caregivers. And disproportionately, refugee families have a disproportionate number of women-headed households, and often those are located in overcrowded and disadvantaged neighbourhoods. There has been, of course, some great examples of inclusion in local childcare services. So when I was working, for instance, in South Africa, we saw some private childcare services really, providing affordable childcare services where refugees were able to access those kind of services. But that is really continues to be the exception. Obviously, another aspect of young refugee children's lives is that the social support provided to their parents and often to the mothers through informal networks in the communities is really essential. And these include things like community outreach volunteers who are going door to door to identify and support families, as well as community-based services. And of course, we shouldn't underestimate that for most young refugee children, they are disproportionately affected by poverty and face particular barriers to access local social services. And often they're living in the most disadvantaged neighbourhoods. So this was definitely very much the case in Cairo. In terms of the 3 top actions that we think could be taken to improve the experience of these children. I mean, there's many, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from our colleagues on the line, but I just wanted to highlight 3 key ones. The first one is really addressing poverty, particularly among women. And this includes things like cash grants, livelihood options for women, as well as provision of childcare for working mothers. The second one is to invest in services for young children and their parents in cities hosting large numbers of refugees, and make those services accessible to refugee women and young children. And the last one I want to highlight is the importance of partnership with refugees, particularly Women Network, to support existing social networks and provide community support, and also, very importantly, provide information about the available services, but also the rights existing in cities. So with that, I'll wrap up. That was a whirlwind tour. I'm really excited to hear from our other colleagues, and over to you, colleagues.
Thank you, Amanda, for also putting it in a nutshell, a very global picture through drawing the experiences that we have in the field, the good practices by some cities, and also letting us know the top 3 actions that would actually improve the experience of refugee children in cities. Thank you. That was crystal clear. So let me, without further ado, again, I would like to move to our next panelist from political leadership, and as a practitioner herself. I had the privilege of meeting with her thanks to Bernard Van Leer Foundation 3 years ago. Teresa Zurita, it's wonderful to see you. When I met you, you were into your 5th term in office as currently former mayor of Boa Vista, but you were a mayor of Boa Vista for 5 terms. It's incredible as a woman leader. So capital of Roraima, state of in the Amazon area, which received also Venezuelan refugees in the recent influx. Since you started your public career in 1990 as federal deputy, you have been defending children's rights, Teresa. So thank you for your wonderful services, which is still continuing. In 2013, as a mayor, you implemented a public policy recognized nationally and internationally, which focused on early childhood development, providing comprehensive care for pregnant women and their children up to 6 years old, This program has been attracting the attention around the world for its scope of services and integrated team management model, which is very important. I hope you will be speaking to that as well. Teresa, you have used your political vision and administrative experience to deal with the challenges in an economic and social crisis scenario as well at the backdrop, turning difficulties, challenges into opportunities and improving public policies, even in a severe Venezuelan humanitarian crisis. So could you please share with us your first-hand experiences as a female, political leader yourself as well? And can you tell us why you decided to make the youngest children in Boa Vista, where you are from as well, a central focus during your time as mayor, and how you included Venezuelan migrant families to start with? Thank you so much. And I just would like to indicate to the audience as well that there is interpretation available in Portuguese too. Thank you.
Bom dia a todos. É prazer imenso estar aqui. Quero cumprimentar.
Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. I would like to greet everybody, and Cecilia, I greatly admire you. I've decided to work on the support to early childhood because this is a lasting kind of focus that I appreciate. It's a type of work that involves promoting lasting change in children, and it generates opportunities in their first years of life in order to shape a much better reality for the rest of their lives. So this is based on scientific evidence and thorough research. That's why I try to focus on early childhood. We know that it involves emotional, psychological, physical structure, and that it prepares children for a much more balanced and happier and healthier life. In Boa Vista, we decided to work on a program called Hosting Families, because a child needs plenty of attention, and therefore we decided to focus on urban infrastructure in partnership with Urban 95 and the Bernard Van Leer Foundation. This work enabled to change our city. We are one of the best cities in Brazil in quality of life for raising children in a very large universe of Brazilian cities. We are the 11th city in Brazil, thanks to this. And always bringing families towards us. With the Venezuelan crisis, we are going through a very difficult program with direct impacts on Boa Vista and early childhood. We believe that hosting migrant children in our social care systems without any differentiation would be the only way to ensure the integration between the two nationalities, because Boa Vista is an isolated city from the rest of Brazil. So in order to tackle xenophobia, integration was the way we thought would be the best. We should tackle in a planned way these issues. So we did some study and we integrated these Venezuelan children, ensuring vacancies for Venezuelan children in childcare. We also followed Venezuelans and children the same way as Brazilian children, making sure we gave them school enrollment, healthcare. And nowadays, 13% of our schools include Venezuelan children. We also help structuring shelters together with the Brazilian Army by a specific program, and we also prepared our teams and our carers with capacity building programs, Spanish language training, So we believe that this was the best way to face the migration crisis in our region. I'm available to speak more about this, but after giving you this first contextualization, I would like to now move on with our meeting.
Thank you, Teresa. But before we move on, if it is possible, to get your advice as a very experienced politician yourself, what advice would you have for other city leaders who also wants to increase their actually contribution and their focus on the most vulnerable babies and toddlers in their cities after all these great examples and the model that you shared with us? Thank you.
É uma situação complexa, eu entendo, né? Porque essa questão.
It's a complex situation because migration differs in every country. I believe that this is what we're going through currently and also in the future, and it depends a great deal on local laws, depends on local religions, and on the existing conditions of each site and each city. We decided to choose hosting in a planned way, and we sought partners to collaborate and to develop these actions and share knowledge in a better and more appropriate way. Bernard Van Leer was indeed our great partner, which greatly helped us. It's important, and I believe, to have a real diagnosis of the situation. Therefore, the joint participation is very important from the High Commissioner for Refugees. This is our most important partner. It's important to build capacity building, to build this understanding. It's also very important to prepare the society for this crisis. Therefore, we can minimize any xenophobic reaction. In Boa Vista, our labor force was mainly focused on education. We also worked with health and social projects. But when enrolling a child in school, we sought to promote an integration between children, between their classmates, families, and naturally the surrounding community. We also try to involve pregnant women in social programs as hosting programs. And through this, we managed to have a very good response to tackle vulnerability. I'd like to highlight this discussion once again, because when working with Bernard Van Leer in Urban 95, we even built a square in the shelter area, and it works in a similar way as other squares. So once again, we can promote this integration principle. It's a very interesting, important discussion, I understand, and I would like to make this very clear that the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees needs to adjust their action, all organizations. Problems happen in cities. We are aware of problems involving hosting, but managers must not be left out of the discussions, and migratory processes must be jointly discussed. So we must do this in a joint way, because most of the time people live outside the shelters, so which means managers then have to deal with these problems. I believe that this discussion can bring an important revolution and the need for this partnership. When I say this, I'm not only talking about funding, I'm talking about partners, the same perspective, the same type of focus. So we must adopt this attitude, and we don't want any segregation between partners. So this is urgent. In my opinion, the best way to move forward is to give the example, and the example must come from leadership. Leaders must be informed, must be present, and must be able to minimize these serious problems. This is the possible contribution I can make right now. Thank you.
Teresa, thank you very much. It's music to our ears because you are actually talking about the very core principles embedded in Global Compact on Refugees, that with its vision of inclusion, meaningful participation of refugees, hand in hand inclusively with host communities, as well as you have been very strongly highlighting the importance of partnerships. That is a very embedded part, a core bone, actually, of a pillar of Global Compact on Refugees that has come to life after the affirmation of majority of states in December 2018. That is what we believe in as well, in partnerships. So thank you for highlighting that part as well as multidimensional complexities, and each city situation needs to be assessed on its own complexities and with the strength of reaching out to as many as possible partners globally, bringing it to the local level as well. Thank you, Teresa, for those words of wisdom, sharing it with us. Thank you. So I would like to move to our next panelist, if I may, Edgar Skrase, our Senior Statistics and Data Analysis Officer from UNHCR. Edgar, wonderful to have you on board with us. And if I can ask you with a kickstarting question, can you tell us how refugee-related data is managed at the city level from the experiences globally that we have? Thank you so much, because data is a very important part of all this analysis and assessment that needs to be done by cities as well. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Maybe just a few quick words about the data that we collect and how that can be useful for cities, and how we also rely on information from cities as well. I mean, I think it's fair to say that the refugee data that's collected at city level, it tends to be very much on an ad hoc basis at the moment. So I think globally, we have data on cities from only some 200, perhaps 250 cities globally. So it's a really kind of a small subset of those cities. But maybe sort of taking a step back at the statistics and looking at the data that we do collect, we really try hard to collect information on the demographics and the subnational data. So I think that was very well highlighted by both previous panelists, why this is important, and why, why this information really kind of helps to underpin really good quality evidence-based informed decision making. The data that we do collect, it's within the official statistics that we publish. So every 6 months we publish data. We publish the end year data in June, and then we've just recently published an update for the first 6 months. The vast majority of that comes from host governments, who then collate that within their own remits and provide that to UNHCR. There is additional data that UNHCR directly collects. Some other humanitarian organisations also provide information, particularly for internally displaced populations. So these would tend to be from a sort of a more diverse, perhaps, range of sources. What we do know is that globally, some 2/3 of refugees live in urban settings, but where really kind of the gap comes is actually the specific locations where those refugees are being hosted. So I think I just did a quick look this morning, but looking at the data that we have from the end of the last year, which is the last set of demographic data we have, we only really have really kind of good, accurate data for around 200,000, 210,000 refugees who are hosted by cities. So this is only 2% of the refugee population. It's very, sorry, of the urban refugee population. So it's a much smaller group. As I mentioned, it's just 200 to 250 cities globally. The kind of the rationale for collecting this information tends to be very much based on operational needs, and I think that was really well highlighted by some of the kind of the keynotes from the last two panelists. We would really kind of look to support that and kind of going forward. So it's really very much an area that we're trying to improve in terms of the data collection. I'll hand you back to you, Safak, there, and then I can perhaps continue with some specific guidelines. Over.
Of course. One more perhaps question that I may pose upon what you have said, because it's a global overview that you have given on how we handle and how we actually share externally our data and how we receive it, but it was more on a national level. Edgar, in your opinion, handling all which is very complex process as well, handling all our data and statistics at a global level, are there initiatives that you think cities can actually contribute the data that they're collecting to improve the overall understanding of the experiences that refugees in cities, including the very young children and their caregivers, are facing, are experiencing? What can cities do beyond the national governments? I mean, apart from, of course, liaising with the national governments as well. But what can cities do, in your opinion?
Absolutely, yeah, and there are some good examples actually of initiatives by individual cities, also forums of cities. So Eurocities, for example, published actually it was back in 2016, but they did some analysis on the number of refugees and asylum seekers that were hosted by sort of 20 or 30 different cities across Europe, which was really, really useful information. So there are initiatives out there, and I think from our perspective in the population statistics team within UNHCR, we'd be very excited to help ensure that was done in a consistent, comparable fashion. So if there are cities out there that would like to try and collect this information, we're very happy to provide some guidance on that, or to help support those initiatives where we can. Maybe just one last point to flag on that would be the responsibility for collecting this information. That where we collect information, where UNHCR collects information, it's really for defined purposes most of the time. So we always try and collect information so that it is of benefit to the people that we're collecting information for, the refugees, the asylum seekers, the internally displaced people, and then also the operational teams in terms of providing the support and the services for those populations. There is some good guidance that was just released by OCHA in October on responsible data. So I'd encourage you, I'll try and paste that into the chat later on, but there's some very good guidelines there that help you quite concretely plan out how you would go about collecting the information, and the framework that you would need to put in place to do that going forwards. But yeah, super excited and really looking forward to the discussion. Thanks. Over.
Thank you, Edgar, for enlightening us on the statistics and data side of things, which is a very complex process. But you also touched upon the document that when you were mentioning, the guidelines by OCHA, that we also work hand in hand in countries with other UN family members. And it would be impossible for us to actually deal with data on our own. But this is a collective effort. So as one UN principle that we have in every country. So, but I would like to also just on that front, what you have mentioned for global data that is released by us annually as well. I would like to invite our busy bee colleagues at the backstage to also post all those core documents, the latest ones in the chat, if they may, please. For the audience to follow. And once again, I would like to invite the participants and the audience to actually pose the questions that they may have, or some of the comments that they may have, some of the reflections that they may have on so far on our panelists' scene-setting remarks. Thank you, Edgar, once again, as our expert for your contribution. So I now would like to move to our next panelist, please, Jonathan Robinson, who's Director of Civic, and is an entrepreneur, author, anthropologist. He's the founder and former global director of Impact Hub that incubates thousands of social enterprises from over 100 physical spaces around the world. Most recently, Jonathan co-founded Civic, an initiative that brings together unlikely allies to reimagine and transform communities. One such community is Azraq, Jordan, where Civic has been working with the refugee and host community to build a vibrant, enterprising community, inclusively with children and families at its heart. So Jonathan, we're delighted to have you on this panel and would like to hear your views. Can you please share a few practical examples as well of how Civic has implemented family-centered approaches in collaboration with camp and municipal authorities in Azraq, Jordan, as a good practice? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So wonderful to be here, and forgive me for cheating slightly, for having just a few images and slides that maybe helps tell the story better than I can without it. So if I may, I'll share my screen and just talk you through quickly a little bit of the story that we've been on. In a way, a journey that has gone from seeing refugees largely as beneficiaries to seeing refugees as active citizens, able to shape and mold the world around them. And this is a journey that spanned my own backyard in East London, Afghanistan, isolated Lesbos, climate resilient Sahel, but also the kind of archetypal context of the Syria-Jordan border. And we started with this very optimistic belief that the world has pretty much whatever it takes to address even our most pressing challenges, and that we're facing a crisis less of resources and much more of wasted talents, spaces, and ideas. And we set out on a mission to activate everything we already have, one neighborhood, one refugee camp at a time. And desperately sad to hear the news at the weekend of Gamal passing away, but what a remarkable gentleman. I remember him welcoming me to Azraq refugee camp some years back. And I admit that in the beginning, we didn't totally see eye to eye. On the left-hand side, the Zatri refugee camp, on the right, Azraq. And in part, learning some of the lessons from Zatri, Azraq was planned as a much more, in a way, military operation. It was very organized, very ordered, but lacked a certain spirit, a certain sense of play and adventure. And not far down the road, Azraq town. And these two contexts struck us both for their humanity, extraordinary welcoming of so many tens of thousands of refugees, both the town and the camp, but also for their bleakness. And so we set about, named by local residents, on a mission to make Azraq alive. We invited together rather unlikely allies, faith leaders, shopkeepers, nursery workers. Gamal himself was the UNHCR camp manager, UN leaders, children, caregivers, even the secret police. And we started to co-create, to imagine a different kind of lived experience, understanding their journey paths, their heritage, their ambitions. And we built a living blueprint around the one thing that everyone could agree on, of children, and giving children the chance to fulfill their one wild and precious life. But of course, caring for childhood means also caring for parenthood, for livelihood, for neighborhood. And so working simultaneously at a kind of macro, meso, and micro level became critical. We invented new models. When we first arrived in Azraq town, within a week, UNICEF sadly pulled the plug on two amazing nurseries that they could no longer afford to sustain at $100,000 a year. So we set about developing a social enterprise model for $10,000 a year and put parents at the heart of it. So it became less a singular nursery and more a kind of family hub, including a parents' lab where challenges and problems they were facing could be addressed together in a collective style. And then new livelihoods, micro-manufacturing of toys and mobility devices and baby carriers. This gentleman lives in Azraq camp and recognized the challenges of taking his kids the miles across the camp. Bathing solutions, toys and musical instruments being made on new equipment. And then the critical role of the relationships between citizens and the government and the UN, and helping those institutions become much more enabling environments, whether that was hijacking the billboards in the local town, co-designing together, using sand and available resources to create public play spaces, murals and painting crosswalks and bus stations, and then ultimately designing new movements. And I think this is maybe the heart of what I'd love to kind of close on, which is the challenge of working in a context where bringing new materials into somewhere like Azraq Camp in the best of times was hard. And of course, when COVID hit, impossible. And so how do you go about transforming a place like this into a more child-friendly environment? Well, you turn to WhatsApp. And we began a conversation that grew to thousands of people sharing their stories. And we launched this competition to invite caregivers to invent new ways of interacting with their children and transforming their backyards from gravel pits into vibrant public spaces. And so began an expression of intimate public play spaces happening on street corners everywhere. And so this vision emerged complex and to some extent rather expansive in its scope, but recognizing the holistic challenges around the child, and that whether it was nurseries or play buses or children's libraries or community kitchens or toy making factories, we needed to address all of these holistic needs. And we even made a little children's book. There were no words. It was narrated by the parents who became so proud of the stories that emerged of their creations. And what did we learn? We learned that we should cook with what we've got. As the beautiful Syrian phrase goes, we learned that we needed to shift imaginations from quite distant gated play spaces to these hundreds of intimate spaces for meeting and culture and play. And we learned about powering the step change in the institutional operating model as UNHCR and UNICEF and others became increasingly the enabling environments. We learned too about hosting good parties. And finally, and in Gamal's generous words to us, in the beginning, he said our vision was impossible. But by the end, he was saying to us, well, this is a little bit extraordinary. What has happened one tiny backyard at a time, hundreds of times over across the camp. It turns out that we can. So forgive me again for the slides, but hopefully that just shares a little bit of the journey that we've been on.
Jonathan, I'm sure that everybody who has followed your presentation will join me in really in a very warm thanks to you that we actually took a different kind of journey, visualization as well. But thank you again on behalf of UNHCR for commemorating our colleague that we have lost, Gamal Yakut, and how this collaboration can work with different multiple partners in a small space through the presentation that you shared with us with so many inspirational sides to it by Azraq Alive. So I think there is no other words to add to that. It also spoke to the spirit of partnerships, multiple partnerships that Teresa was mentioning of from her experience as a leader of a city. So thank you so much for also taking us on a journey of Azraq Camp that made us so clear, crystal clear in our eyes. Thank you. Thank you for your contribution. Very inspirational indeed. I would like to move to our next panelist, if I may, Sara Kandrachi, Arup International Development Group. Sara is an associate director in Arup, where she leads the work on inclusive and resilient cities, including on child-centered design and planning. She's an urban planner herself and researcher with 20 years of experience working in the field of sustainable urban development and planning across Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. A global person herself, recently Sara led the development of the Proximity of Care Design Guide to support the design and implementation of child and family-friendly interventions in vulnerable urban environments. So after a camp situation that Jonathan spoke of, it would be nice to hear from you, Sara. In the urban environments, Arup developed the Proximity of Care Design Guide. What is it and how can it help city leaders and urban planners? Thank you for your scene-setting remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for the introduction. It's really great to be here. So yes, today I'd like to talk about the Proximity of Care Design Guide, which is the result of the collaboration between ARUP and the Bernabala Foundation. For who doesn't know, ARUP is a design plan engineering company that is working globally, and we have an international development group where I'm based. So basically what we did with the Bernabala Foundation, we combined ARUP's design and plan expertise with the foundation knowledge of early childhood development to develop a practical tool to support the design and implementation of cost-effective, but still dignifying and well-designed intervention in former refugee settlements. So interventions mainly aiming at improving the living condition, the well-being of young children, also the caregivers, pregnant women, and the wider community. We decided to develop this guide because we saw that, as we know, as it was said, children, caregivers, pregnant women, and of course the broader community living in refugee settlements are especially vulnerable and affected by the lack of basic services, inadequate living conditions, also limited opportunities for individual and community growth. They are also increasingly affected by the impact of climate change that is making the situation even worse. And based on our work and research, we saw that the needs of young children often go unheard in decision-making and planning. In fact, what we saw that normally urban professionals, of course, excluding civic, but normally urban professionals working in this context, they tend to deliver infrastructure and urban solutions that mainly focus on the functional needs of the residents. They don't look at the needs, developmental needs of young children. And also existing early childhood investments are mainly focused on the provision of formal education services, healthcare, nutrition programs, which of course are very important, but their impact could be much bigger if developed in conjunction with urban professionals, and also if these interventions would be included in the planning and design of urban interventions. As we saw, the early years of a child is crucial because for their healthy physical and mental development. And we know that to develop to their full potentials, babies and toddlers, they require not only the minimum basic functional needs of good nutrition, healthcare, clean air and water, but they also need to live and be surrounded by an environment which provides plenty of opportunity to explore safely, also to play and to experience warm and responsive human interactions. So the Proximity of Care Design Guide was developed with intent to create a bridge and also create a common language between urban professionals, early childhood development specialists, and also humanitarian development experts who work in informal settlement, but sometimes the work is not well coordinated or integrated. Because we also wanted to establish a common ground of collaboration so that together they can jointly create healthy, supportive, stimulating, and protective environments where children can thrive. The development of the guide has been driven by ARUP concept of total design, which is a multidisciplinary approach to design, which implies that greater solutions can be accomplished when technical knowledge, design, and aesthetic unite, and when all professionals, they work together since the beginning. In fact, as we said, in order to address the complexity and multiple challenges that are common in informal refugee settlements, and also to untap the existing opportunity that exists in those communities, there is a need for a multidisciplinary approach to design and planning, and also requires a greater collaboration among the professionals that are involved. So the guide, that's why we developed the guide in close collaboration with several organizations, including Civic, Catalytic Action, KDI, and VPU. And we developed the research and also conducted the field work in Kenya, Lebanon, Jordan, and South Africa. To make it also more user relevant, we set up a technical review committee, which involved a group of experts and decision makers from humanitarian development organizations, but also from civic city authorities and also the urban industry. So the guide is available online, is a digital tool, which is structured around 3 core sections that are they represent the key stages of a design process, which are understand, design, and influence. So under each section, we identify key principles, practical tools, and also inspiring case studies from around the world to support the users of the guide to understand the context and beneficiaries of their study area, to design meaningful and cost-effective interventions, and also to influence, which is very important, to influence decision makers and planners on why a child-focused approach is important and how this approach will benefit also their work. So the guide was initially conceived before COVID. We launched it last year. And we saw that, and it was aimed primarily at interventions in informal refugee settlements. But with COVID, there's been an increasing worse situation in terms of urban families that have been pushed into poverty around the world. So an urgent needs also to not work only in refugee and informal settlement, but also in other cities where vulnerabilities are also very high. So we are now starting a new phase of this project, always in collaboration with the Bernabara Foundation, aiming at supporting the implementation and uptake of the guide, the dissemination, and also to review it and make it more relevant also for other contexts and geographies. So as I said, the guide is online at www.proximityofcare.com. So please take a look and of course get in touch if you want to hear more. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah, for also introducing us to this program of Proximity of Care Design Guide and the challenges that have been faced as well in the making of it, in generally in the urban settings, urban environments. Thank you so much. You gave us a different perspective to conclude our panel actually with the last call to action and pledging that will be explained by our colleague Claire Roberts-Lemon from UNHCR. She is the lead globally, who works on all things cities related. Thank you, Claire. Over to you.
Thank you, Shafak. And I know we're short of time, so I'll keep my remarks to as short as possible. So while we know that cities all over the world have been providing for a long time many services to refugees, migrants, internally displaced and stateless people, UNHCR has recently developed a series of mechanisms to recognize these contributions globally in various ways. So the first one is through the Cities with Refugees campaign, which is a solidarity statement written by two cities, which is essentially a city declaring itself a place of welcome. We have just 270 city signatories to that. I'll put the link in the chat. You can, if you are in a city that hasn't signed, you can share it with your mayor and encourage them to sign. We've also recently developed a good practice and innovative approaches guide where we're collecting good practices. Edgar touched on the importance of having information about what's happening in cities. This is one way that we're starting to sort of nudge our way into the service provision and some of the data that cities are collecting about their refugee residents. I'll also put that in the chat. And finally, in 2019, Shafak mentioned the Global Compact on Refugees, which recognizes the important role of cities as frontline responders to refugee crises. And in 2019, we had at the first Global Refugee Forum more than 1,500 pledges by different actors, so states, universities, NGOs, private sector, and we had a few from cities. But what we really want to see is even more cities pledging their support, namely because we want to make sure that we're recognizing this crucial and long-term work happening by cities in the achieving the ambitions of the Global Compact on refugees. So I really encourage cities to pledge their support and really hope this conversation inspires action by cities to support the youngest refugees in the cities that they live. So I'll leave it at that because I know there's some questions that want to be answered. Thank you, Shafak.
Thank you, Claire, for that very clear, actually, call to action, and to put it in a nutshell from our end as well, what can be done in the pledging process, as well as being a signatory as cities to that advocacy tool that we have for creating inclusive cities for refugees and alike with host communities. So I would like to move on to the questions and answers. Yes, we are running a few minutes late. But I would like to give the floor actually to Amanda, a question that was posed by Samer Saleba, who's another actually a great partner to us, Mayor's Migration Council. He's a manager there. And I would like to pose the question to you, Amanda. Samer says, I'm curious how your focus on women networks operates in cities and how inclusive they are of receiving communities, and if so, what that does for social cohesion between refugee and receiving communities. Over to you, Amanda.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for that question. I mean, I think from us, the example that was provided about the how to make ASRAC alive is really the kind of model that we think is important on how we engage also women networks. I mean, the first step is really to look at what are the existing formal and informal networks of women. And often in refugee hosting communities, you will have the formal women NGOs or civil society networks, but you may have more informal networks. Sometimes those formal networks include refugees, sometimes not. So the first step, I think, from our side is really looking at what are the existing kind of formal networks of women and what are some of the potentially formal, but more often informal networks, women networks of refugees, and then looking at kind of facilitating a bottom-up process of trying to consult with refugee women to understand from their perspective, how could we support what is the existing ways in which they are engaged in their own communities, very similar to the really quite fascinating presentation done by Jonathan on that kind of bottom-up and refugee-led design. Thanks.
Thank you, Amanda. And I take it as your concluding remarks as well, if that's okay, unless you want to add something else as a reflection as your concluding remark, because I will be turning to other panelists of ours for responses to other questions that came from the floor. So thank you. And I would like to move to another question. Shirley Akhter and Wangari Mwangi has asked, through which language you educate refugee children? This is a big, hot, burning question for all of us. We should be careful not to disadvantage or alienate the children any further than the refugee experience has already done. This is a big question for us and a big challenge, actually, in a parliamentary roundtable that we held very recently with parliamentarians across the world. This comes up, of course, in the national education systems and inclusiveness of it. But what can cities offer? And I would like to turn there to another politician that we had actually at the table. Teresa, would you like to answer that question? How did you manage the language issues of refugee children? Because Brazil has Portuguese and Venezuelan kids had Spanish. So how did you handle that? Thank you. And any other concluding remarks, please? We would like to welcome your wisdom.
Well, we worked with the capacitation of our employees in all the areas of attending in the municipality. So we train them in Spanish, our teachers, our nurses, our doctors, in the schools, the student assistants. So we made all the signals in the city were in Spanish as in Portuguese and in English too, all the signage, because we also had in English. Well, we didn't want this action to be just focused on the Venezuelan issue. So we need to overcome the xenophobic issue here. So we had an understanding from our workers in this action to integrate, to include within our activities in the municipality of Boa Vista. Something that is very interesting is that children adapt easily to the situations. So inside the schools, mostly, the children themselves became the translators for teachers and for students. And this happens naturally. So, since children adapt better to new situations than adults, facilitates that integration. Another thing that we did, a very important thing, is that the assessment exams for schools where children were inserted in the classroom, the exams now are in Spanish, not in Portuguese, so that the child who is arriving doesn't lose the knowledge that they came with from the other country. And they can start in the right level. So this was also another attitude, another decision that facilitated greatly the integration. Regarding health, vaccinations, the vaccines bulletin, well, we have an immigration law. When we ask for asylum, the person becomes a Brazilian citizen. So it makes it easier for our actions to be official accurately, differently from other countries that have not the same opportunity. So we take advantage of these situations where we can work with this integration in the point of view of the child, of course, always, so that we can integrate both nationalities. I assure you that we had a very positive result, working in partnership with the pregnant mothers, pregnant women and their children which are born within our social programs, our visits during gestation, during pregnancy. It was a partnership between Brazilians and Venezuelans. We start to change attitudes where you cannot see the nationality of the person, but you see the human being. You work with the need of the human being. I think that this look, this perspective, this humanitarian look, giving the example to a municipality being empowered to do that was the most important point to develop this work. So we had partners, as I said. Without partners, it is impossible to work this issue. Of course, we struggled. I cannot say that it was wonderful because we had that problem. It's a serious problem. But this look of human needs is something that we used as the basis to integrate with the focus on the child. This work was understood by society.
There is, on behalf of everyone here around the table, I would like to just express all our gratitude and admiration and respect for being such a leader and actually committing to your principles, never giving up on them. You are an inspiration across the globe, actually, with the model that you have created, with the love and respect that you already deserved and received from the constituency as well, from your city. That is a big indicator as a politician as well, as a woman leader. Thank you. With all our respect, you just spoke to all the core principles of our protection principles that is based back in 51 Convention as well as Global Compact on Refugees. There's no further words that we can add to this, what you have shared with us. Thank you. Thank you for being such a great contributor to this. And by the way, just for all the, as I said, we are running a few minutes.
Muito obrigada pela oportunidade de estar aqui com vocês.
Muito obrigada.
Thank you for the opportunity for being here with you.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us, for your time, for your dedication, really. And I would like to move to our, thank you. I would like to move to our other panelists, just to quickly answer perhaps the last question that we have received. And that is from Gabrielle, who didn't indicate what the title is, but how much nature regarding the construction and maintenance of green areas is taken into account when designing areas for refugee children and in desert environments? Jonathan and Sarah, I will turn to you for quick concluding remarks on any kind of example that you can share, as Azraq Alive is also a desert environment with a lot of water scarcity, to you too. And then for Edgar to share any reflections, any recommendations on the data collection. And then I will move to the concluding remarks by Cecilia Vasa. So over to you, Sarah and Jonathan, afterwards. Thank you.
Okay, maybe shall I start? So yeah, definitely nature is one of the recommendations that we provide also in the design guide. So how to design nature-based solutions that also takes into account the needs of children, so that they can be playful and at the same time the solutions that address issues related to climate, for instance. Of course, when we work in desert areas, there's of course a big issue related to the lack of water. So the very challenging situation in relation to maintenance, but also more broadly, also so like in former settlement in Kalicha, in township where we've been working. Also there, the fact that nature maybe is not really taken care of, and sometimes they use like the trees also for the teeth brush, for instance. So I think there are two things: what is feasible to do using technologies. There is a good example in Antofagasta in Chile, where we work. I was not involved in that project, but a colleague of mine been working that project in an informal settlement in Antofagasta, where in a desert area, they managed to create a system for utilizing the water from the sewage system for greening the area. So the information, I think, is available online. But of course, when you work with nature, there is on one hand technical solutions, and on the other hand also creating awareness in relation to respect of nature, maintenance also. So that's why it's important to always work with communities, so that you create like, I don't know, a committee responsible for the maintenance of green spaces, for instance, so that the importance of nature is also embedded and taken care of by the different communities.
Thank you, Sarah, for giving us those examples as well with your expertise. Jonathan, can I turn to you on the same question and any concluding remarks that you would like to share with us? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Sarah, that was beautiful. And it reminds me, forgive me for sharing a rather harrowing reminder. So I was talking to a young girl in Azraq camp, and I was talking to her about dreams. And she said to me, my dream for the future is to see a tree. And how extraordinary that a young girl could grow up without seeing a tree. And in response, and as you kind of got a glimpse of, I think what's happening is a kind of rewilding, but 1 square meter at a time. And as Sarah, as you were saying, kind of hosted intimately within family units. And what we learned both around greening, but also about intimate and micro play spaces, was the power of hosts and the role particularly of grandmothers, grandparents in playing host to a process of rewilding, a process of play coming alive in tiny, intimate backyard spaces.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, on those concluding remarks, as well as sharing with us that very, again, touching and inspirational, without seeing a tree, but wishing to actually contribute and to see a tree as well. A Chinese proverb is actually that planting a tree now is a breeze for the next generation. So being, nature-oriented solutions also being at the core of UNHCR's principles and global compact as well, which tries to answer the challenges in multi-partnership way. We have initiatives, and we have a special envoy on climate change, as well as greening initiatives in the camp situations where we can have more control. I would like to invite Claire to also share those initiatives that are available to external audience in the chat. So we very much care about greening, and we have a strategy, multi-year strategy on that as well in our camp situations where we can have more say and can do more, better, actually. So we are committed to that, greening policies. I would like to turn to Cecilia now for concluding remarks. Would like to thank actually all our panelists. I think Edgar, let me check with you once again if you have any concluding remarks or any kind of recommendation from data and statistics.
No, thank you very much. Nothing further to add. Just no problem. Standing by and looking forward to helping your cities improve their data. Thanks. Over.
Thank you, Edgar. Thank you very much. Cecilia, it's over to you. But before that, I just want to re-emphasize that how much we care and how much we cherish this partnership and hope to create a synergy amongst us and beyond with these partners who were on this panel and beyond in the audience as well, to anything that we can do to better the lives of migrant and refugee children, displaced children in city and urban environments, along with host community children as well and their caregivers. Over to you, Cecilia, for concluding remarks, and we will be closing it right after.
Thank you, Shafak, and thank you to all the speakers, because I really think that each one of you has brought the importance of having a diverse number of stakeholders that can actually speak from the experience, but that can actually highlight some very important facts. So I just want to highlight some of the most important takeaways for me after listening to each of you. The first one, the importance of gathering responsible data, because I do think that once that we have responsible data, we can make the right policy and the right response in this very complex context. The second thing is, do consider refugees or any displaced people as active citizens, because then is when we can really transform the idea of not having beneficiaries, but actually people who can actively contribute to changing the ecosystem we're trying to change. The third thing, which I found very powerful from all of the different experiences, is that if you can really see the needs of people, but starting from the needs of children, and then understanding which are the immediate needs of the parents and the community that's surrounding the well-being of these children, then we're really going to be able to get successful solutions that can work for everybody else. So thank you, Jonathan, for sharing such a powerful story, and Sarah for really showing us very specific tools on how we can transform the ecosystems where children can really start thriving if we really respond to the needs that they are trying to show in these very difficult conditions. And finally, but not least, the importance of really having leaders that can walk the talk, that can listen to refugees, that can just be there on understanding their real needs, but actually building together with them what they want to become and transform this immediate environment that we want to work with. So I know that we're over time, so I just want to finish saying that this is just one of the first conversations that we're starting, Shafak, as you were saying. But just to highlight the importance of really bringing all this diversity of voices coming from very different contexts, coming from very different backgrounds, because this is the only real way that we can learn how to find the right solutions for all. Thank you so much, and thank you for sharing.
Thank you very much. Once again, we are delighted to have this partnership with Bernard Van Leer Foundation, and also all partners, all participants that have interactively contributed to this conversation. Thank you so much for your time. Please watch this space, and we will be also disseminating this conversation globally through PHAP, our great partner in facilitating this webinar. Thank you, Marcus Forsberg, once again, and to all our interpreters for accommodating the additional time when we exceeded. Thank you. Wishing, wherever you may be, wishing you a good afternoon, good evening, or good morning. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.